Chapter 8. Hunters and Hunted. The stillness of the moment was absolute as they shared a long stare. In the silence between them, the crackle of the fire and hiss of wind were sharp as razors in her ears. Slowly, from behind leaden lips, she found her voice. "You're crazy." She stood, and he rose with her. "I'm going," she said clearly, panic slipping into her voice. Caleb's smile was flickering, a pained grimace slipping through his composure. He spoke in a murmur, barely above the wind. "I may be mad, but I'm not a sadist. If I let you go out there, the things that will happen to you—" He giggled fitfully. "Worse, you might live and keep going as you are." He shook his head, humor passing. Then he lunged. The first slash would have finished her. His movements were blinding fast. Caleb was a twisting coil of muscle that had gone flying by her as some unconscious flinch had pulled her a hand's breadth out of his path. As he straightened, a faint smile was now playing at the corners of his mouth. "They didn't quite stomp all the survival instinct out of you, he mused. "Well, I can't deny." He broke into a predatory grin. "I'd have been a little disappointed if you hadn't tried to run at all." There was a final moment of stillness. Then she broke into a sprint. Around her was a writhing mass of green, spilling over every block of crumbling architecture. There were no markers to navigate by, no indications of where there might be some reprieve, but that was just as well. She could focus on little more than one foot in front of the other, the next step, and she was quickly gasping. Vaulting over the fallen column where she had lain in rest, she launched herself into what seemed to have once been a path, stone posts crumbling. There was no room for thought. She fled along the simplest route to anywhere else. Behind her, the sounds of erratic footfalls and breathing followed close on her heels. Her mind, well beyond being able to process the full terror of the lethal pursuit, snagged on minute details. The path was growing less mossy, paved with well-worn stone. The trees were thinning out on either side. She was running into an open pavilion, and where all else seemed dilapidated and forgotten, at the center of it all there was a massive marble monument of some sort. She could not determine its subject. She had already run past it. There were great intact pillars ahead, at least 5 times her height, and even a semblance of a roof, casting cavernous shadows ahead. A coherent thought. If she could get there, she might find a place to hide, to give the mad elf the slip. She was not fully certain how long she had been running, but she could not keep up the pace for much longer. Passing under those dark arches, she briefly allowed herself a glance over her shoulder. She was alone. Blinking uncomprehendingly, she felt relief that turned in short order to fresh panic. After a few more stumbling steps into the blackness, she knelt behind a column, falling into shadow. The tang of bile was on her tongue, and, rocking, she thought of the warm library she had left behind, the sunlit garden, the comforts of home. She thought of the calming roll of the caravan. For some reason, she even thought of Adrian. The memories tore through her like a physical need, and it was all the worse because she knew she had no right to any of it. She saw Iris's disgust, Moira's fury, Adrian's fear as she failed each of them in turn. Somehow, those looks seemed to follow her everywhere she went. "I'm sorry." Kendra spasmed back, colliding hard against the pillar as the voice rang out from deeper within the darkness. A pair of darkly maroon eyes, luminous, looked down at her. "It was cruel of me to let you run." There was a rustling, a shifting of weight, and something cold and sharp touched her throat. "I'll make it quick." The voice was soft, almost comforting. There was a cacophonous rumbling, sudden and terribly near, as something moved in the dark. A scuffle, a clatter, and a strangled cry, and a hot wave of wind fell over her face for a moment. The blade had been lifted from her throat, gone but for a stinging line that trickled lightly. She did not attend to it. Kendra shrank into the pillar, utterly motionless, primordially terrified. Whatever it was moved off in heavy footsteps, Caleb snarling and thrashing against some force cloaked in the blackness. A flash and crackle in the darkness, as if a flicker of lightning had erupted. Some 10 paces off, a lantern had been lit, and cast into relief in the darkness was a massive shape, looming like a hilltop. After several moments of shocked staring, she realized that it was in the shape of a man, or roughly so. It might have been said to be more akin to the shape of a boulder, crudely hewn, taller than a wagon and nearly as broad. Some small part of Kendra's mind that was not cowering in fear marveled. Another legend made flesh, sprung from an afternoon's daydream. She flinched back at a deep rumbling like thunder, as if a hillside could speak, before she recognized that it was indeed words. "Why are you here, little bug?" The words came slow, as if each had been selected with great difficulty and care. He was standing by some surface, nearly over her standing height, and there he held Caleb's squirming form. "I've no quarrel with you, giant! Let me go!" Caleb spat the words, thrashing, nearly feral in his struggle. The giant seemed to notice not at all. "Come into my home, uninvited, unwanted." It could not be said what emotion the voice conveyed, but the massive body shifted slightly, and Caleb screamed. "Thief! Maybe more of you?" Amidst the cursing and writhing, Kendra became aware of a weight on her foot. In the faint lantern light over the giant's shoulder, she saw Caleb's knife. Carefully, so as to not make a sound, she lifted it. It was terribly heavy, and to its touch it did not feel like metal. She gripped it tightly, knuckles a bloodless white, and slowly she found it in herself to stand and peek at the mouth of the structure. Daylight was tantalizingly near. Nervously, she turned back. Caleb was looking directly at her. They could see each other clearly now that she was standing. He paused in his struggle, his fathomless eyes fiery with fury, but somehow resigned, meeting her own. "I came alone," he snarled, "but I'm not a damn thief." "Come to my workshop. Loud. Bad. Why can't they leave me alone?" The giant was not listening, barely seemed to be paying attention. There was a muffled crack, and Caleb howled. Kendra flinched in horror as the scream spiraled into a piteous whine. She felt immeasurably small in this place, insignificant, but by the same token she could still leave unnoticed. The monster hadn't seen her yet. Yes, she could escape. She couldn't move. Terror shook her legs, but it wasn't that rooted her in place. Looking up to the dark, hulking shape that obscured Caleb, something stirred in her. She swallowed, adjusted her grasp on the knife, and stepped forward. She was at the giant's back before she knew it, the steps seemingly having passed without her taking them. Stopping herself short, she stood frozen in its shadow. The hide that stretched out before her seemed tough and implacable, like a slab of granite. Shifting her grip once or twice, she knelt, mind racing. Then, purposefully, she flung the knife hard away from herself into the unseen depths of the hall. The giant moved faster than she could have believed, turning on that fantastic clatter of stone against stone, ringing distantly. Dodging narrowly out of the way of its shifting bulk, she crumpled into a heap, clenching her teeth as an elbow made sharp contact with the stony floor. "More," rumbled the brewing storm of a voice, and her entire body tensed, the breath caught in her chest. There was a moment of complete stillness as the voice and the clattering echoed between the columns. Then the giant began to stomp away, moving off towards the distraction. Kendra breathed and scrambled to her feet. She was head height with the surface that held Caleb, and she could see now that he had been laid on a sort of great workbench, strewn among hammers and chisels of many sizes. The breath caught in her throat. He was limp, his eyes glassy. She watched in inexplicable fear for several long moments before she was certain that his chest still rose and fell. Hurriedly, she heaved herself onto the edge of the table, clumsy and dangling halfway, enough to get a grasp on his shirt. With a strength earned only in the last month on the roads, she hauled him over the edge. Her shoulder cracked painfully against the smooth floor, and she gasped before Caleb slid moments later headlong into her chest, crushing air from her. Kendra was lying dazed on the floor when blinding light flashed over her in an arc of pure white, accompanied by an explosive roar. It sprang over the surface of the workbench, its passing scattering tools to clatter deafeningly beside her, a hammer slamming inches in front of her face. Her body burning like fire, she pushed up the weight that lay heavily across her and scrambled to drag him behind the dais. Somewhere in the distance, she half thought she heard a strangled cry. "Trespassers!" growled the giant in a voice like a landslide that could hate. "This is my final work, a last quiet place to think before the end. Buzzing insects coming in, screaming in my ears." Kendra pulled Caleb onto her back with a terrible effort. He was a pile of slack muscle, groaning faintly. "Come on, you bastard," she mumbled through gasping breaths, the light growing all around her hiding place. She was on her feet, taking a staggering step to the cover of the closest column. A terrible face loomed overhead, wreathed in a crackling energy that would have outshone the sun. "Found you, little bug." Kendra scarcely looked up. Strength that she didn't know she possessed pumped her legs violently. She had paused for barely a moment when there was another flash, another bone-rattling blast, and fragments of stone cascaded over her. A glance back, and she knew it was still following, the light already gathering once more. She staggered on, again just slipping behind the cover of another column, when it too burst to pieces. A stone struck against her ankle, and suddenly she was watching as the ground drew nearer, her body tossed with casual disregard. Then, with a crack, her face sharply met the floor. Rubble was all around her, and as her chest heaved with exertion, she found her limbs no longer were obeying her commands. After a final moment of strained effort, she slumped, bright light drawing ever nearer, Caleb's face almost pressed to hers. He looked quite as weary as she felt, and if she could have breathed, she would have laughed. Somewhere, the wind was whistling sharply. Far above her, the great figure was looking down on her. A single eye glared with an unquenchable, inhuman fury. "Little's all the same," he rumbled on, his unbroken string of oaths ringing overwhelmingly in her ears. "Always ruin everything, always. Honorless, artless, without respect." The Cyclops gathered lightning in each raised fist, swirling about the crown of his head. "Eye of the storm," she thought with a moment of frantic humor, even as her fingernails scrabbled for purchase against the stone, trying to haul Caleb aloft. But there was nothing to be done. Her limbs would not obey, not nearly fast enough. She couldn't even save her own worthless hide. Suddenly, there was darkness. She was wrapped in something soft, and opening her eyes, there was nothing but blackest night. She had the sensation of great motion, her stomach turning, the wind overwhelming, the sound of an outraged howl which was already falling behind. Utterly without direction, she held tightly to the rough collar of Caleb's shirt. Daylight streamed blindingly onto her face, and she blinked, shielding her eyes. From somewhere far below there was a final roar and an explosion. She looked down and gasped. With a terrible vertigo, Kendra clenched tightly to the knot of branches that held her in a loose tangle high in the arms of the massive tree. Concealed amidst a lattice of branches and leaves at least 100 feet below was the temple of the Cyclops. It had seemed cavernous from the ground. From her current vantage point, she watched in awe as the magnificent rafters of the roof shook, then began to collapse. The thunderous cursing grew muffled in a cacophony of falling stone, and after a few moments the noise stopped. A great cloud of gray dust billowed up, spreading about the building. In the courtyard she had run through, there stood a statue in the shape of an enormous woman, kneeling solemnly, smooth of stony skin and long of hair. Then the plume of dust rose further, and she could see no more. Turning away from the gut-wrenching drop, she looked to the weight that lay across her legs. Lying strewn in disarray were 2 bodies. Caleb was battered and bleeding gently, one leg dangling precariously off of the thick tree branch where they perched. And to her right, tucked shivering into the crook of her arm, knelt Adrian.